Welcome to all students in design of transmission system. Today we discuss about selection of bearing. Bearing is a mechanical element which supports two machine parts and permits relative motion between them with minimum friction. It has two or more contacting surfaces and load carrying components. The function of bearing is the bearing ensures relative motion between two machine parts with minimum friction. The bearing supports and locates the shaft in its correct position. The bearing takes the load and forces acting on the shaft and transfer it to the stationary frame or journal. In classification of bearings are may be classified many ways. The important classification is depend upon the criteria like depending on the direction of load and depending on nature of frictional contact, and depending on direction of load there is radial and thrust bearing, and depending on the nature there is sliding contact and rolling contact bearing. So this is the criteria of the selection of the bearing. In types of rolling contact bearing, there are two types, ball bearing and roller bearing. In ball bearings there are 6 types like single row deep groove ball bearing, single row deep groove ball bearing with notch, self-aligning bearing, double row deep groove ball bearing, thrust ball bearing, angular contact bearing. In roller bearing, cylindrical roller bearing, spherical roller bearing, taper roller bearing, needle roller bearing. So in ball bearings, when the radial load is served, single row deep groove, filling notch, angular contact and double row and self-aligning bearing. So radial bearing and angular contact bearing. This is the bearing, angular contact bearing and self-aligning bearing. The balls are inserted into the grooves by moving the inner ring to eccentric position in deep groove ball bearing. Radial load capacity of filling notch bearing can be increased by inserting balls, but thrust load capacity decreases due to bumping of the balls against the edge of notch. In seal bearing, lubricated at factory. In shielded bearing, protect against the dirt. The thrust ball bearing, this is the types of bearing. In thrust ball bearing, the thrust ball bearing are used to carrying thrust loads exclusively at the speed below 2000 rpm at high speeds, and centrifugal force causes the balls to be forced out of the races. Therefore, at high speeds it is recommended that the angular contact ball bearing should be used in place of thrust ball bearing. So thrust ball bearing is a very important part in these types of bearing. The thrust ball bearing consists of spherical balls running between two rings and shaft and housing ring. The shaft ring rotates along with the rotating shaft such that its machine surface which makes contact with the balls in perpendicular to the axis of rotation. These bearings can take only the thrust load and no radial load. In roller bearing, now we discuss about very important point, the selection of bearing. In selection of bearing life, the selection of proper size of bearing is depend on expected life of the bearing for a given application. So now we discuss about bearing life. This is a bearing. Okay. If the expected life of bearing is not very high, the selection of if the expected life of bearing is not very high, then the lower series bearing can be selected, but it increases the frequency of bearing replacement. The life of bearing can be expressed as: first, bearing life in million revolutions. It is used for defining bearing life for applications which do not run at a constant speed, that is automotive vehicles. Bearing life in number of services. It is used for defining bearing life for applications which run at a constant speed, that is industrial machines, that is electrical motors. The recommended bearing life for vehicle application is given like the automobile cars, 50 million per revolution, trucks 100 million per revolution, trolley cars 500 million per revolutions, railroad cars 1000 million per revolutions. So it is very important type. Now we discuss about bearing life for industrial life. First, machine use for short periods or intermittently whose breakdown would not have serious consequence. That is, life is 4000 to 800. Machines working intermittently and whose breakdown would have serious consequence. Life is 800, 8000 to 12000. Machines for use of 8 hours per day and not always fully utilized in it. 12,000 to 20,000 life in hours. Machines for use of 8 hours per day and fully utilized, that is 20,000 to 30,000. So it is very important for bearing life in industrial equation. Also, the machines for continuous use of 20 hours per day, the life is 40,000 to 60,000. Machines required work with a high degree of reliability of 24 hours per day, life is 1 lakh to 20 lakh per hour. So this is the life of bearing. So in needle bearings are very useful where radial space is limited. They may be used without separators and dressers. So thanks all of you.